So my name is Patricia Kaziro. I'm the Director of Impact Business School, and today I'm talking to Dr. Stephen Morse, the CEO of Unchained Solutions, a Sydney-based advisory firm helping organisations improve their environmental, social and governance reporting and corporate social responsibility commitments while ensuring compliance with the Modern Slavery Act. Stephen brings over 25 years of leadership experience in both the not-for-profit and private sectors. He earned his doctorate in human trafficking intervention from Fuller Theological Seminary in 2016 and is a thought leader in human rights due diligence in supply chains. Stephen also chairs the Ethics Committee of the Australasian Supply Chain Institute and serves in other key advisory roles, contributing his expertise to ethical business practices worldwide. Stephen, I'm delighted to talk with you today.
Thanks, Patricia. Every time I hear 2016, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's 10 years ago. I can't believe I finished that work 10 years ago. It just seems like such a lifetime away. But anyway, it's good to have it done. I reflect on that every time thinking, oh, wow, that was a big achievement. It's done.
Absolutely. And what we'd love to do today is hear more about your journey before and post 2016. So let's get started. If you could introduce your organisation, its mission, and some of the communities or stakeholders that you work with.
Sure. So Unchained, we're a professional services advisory firm. We're also registered and certified as a social enterprise with social traders, and we're also B Corp certified as well. The core of our work is around working with companies in the private sector and some government as well to help them to improve their adherence, their compliance, alignment with key human rights due diligence legislation, such as the Australian Modern Slavery Act and other international directives and guidance as well. We also branch out also into the other ESG areas, so environmental, social and governance, work with a range of companies that could be helping them to understand and be more strategic in environmental matters such as biodiversity or climate change. Could be in the social zone, helping more internal issues around diversity, equity, inclusion, or Indigenous awareness and reconciliation, as well as in the governance space, better board engagement, equality on boards, and making sure there's actually good adherence to more contentious contemporary issues around data security and anti-money laundering as well.
So you're working across quite a few different areas. And what does the human rights in business mean in terms of the solutions you provide?
Sure. So it's our core. Yeah. So it's our core solution area. We don't specialize in all those other areas. We work. We've got a solution hub. So because we can't do everything. So when I say that, it's kind of we're more in the area of strategy and documents and training with those other areas. When it comes to the core area, what we do, it's around workplace exploitation, worker exploitation, forced labor issues, human trafficking under the rubric of modern slavery. And we work with companies. There's clear reporting guidelines in Australia, for example, and we help companies to make sure they're tracking with those criteria. That could be, for example, in relation to governance and policies and procedures and mechanisms, worker voice mechanisms, remediation, adequate training for teams, for example. We'll also help companies to map out their entire value chain, particularly the upstream supply chain, where we categorize their suppliers and assess them for certain risks according to geographic risks, business type risks, vulnerable populations, and also the industry that they're in. So that's the core kind of work we do around risk assessing policies and helping companies to better report on what they're doing and make sure that reporting is authentic and there's adherence to continuous improvement.
Brilliant. And how do you help companies to see that this is not simply a compliance issue and so that they can understand it as an ongoing ethical and operational responsibility?
Well, that's one of our biggest challenges because...
So just talk me through that.
That is a big challenge, and I can't say that we're always able to do that successfully. So at a minimum, we want to help companies to operate more ethically, more responsibly, and most companies would appeal to that. Yes, we want to make sure that we are operating well. What that means can at times be quite subjective, but the compliance function really serves to as the ethical baseline, the ethical standard But for me, always ethics and law are two different categories, and so you can do things ethically and legally, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So, in terms of then helping companies to go beyond that, that is the challenge to help them to see, for example, that the core work, yes, is around making sure that good governance structures are in place and frameworks and risk management frameworks are in place. That they're also tracking well with impact measurement and measuring the effectiveness of those actions. But that's just one area of due diligence. There's a lot that needs to go around the sort of the location of where exploitation might occur. The exploitation may be occurring in a factory in a particular city, in a particular jurisdiction, but there are lots of contributing factors in there. Questions around poverty and lack of opportunity, areas of increased exploitation. And so it's not just a question of kind of making sure that the factory that they're buying from is doing the right thing and is doing well, but actually the whole community is also that supports that factory and through which that factory actually operates is also doing well. So there's a lot that can be done. We speak about that. We can point to that. We have a multitude of partners overseas, both in the not-for-profit sector, social enterprise sector, to help companies partner with them. But if there's no appetite for that, we can draw companies to that source of doing good and being of benefit and making a positive contribution, not just avoiding doing harm, but actually how they can actually be of benefit. And that's a long-term game. Not everyone is on board with that necessarily, or they might be on board, but not necessarily in that way. They might have other projects that they're doing, projects that may be more closer to home. And for example, they might be more focused on what's going on internally within the organization to make sure that there's diversity and inclusion, for example, there's gender equality, or they might be more working domestically within the Australian context, if that's where they are, to have a stronger Indigenous engagement as well, or working with all sorts of underserved communities. So we don't make any judgments about that. This is just our passion area, but we understand that companies can be also focused on other areas.
Mm. And can you give us an insight into where organisations tend to struggle when it comes to identifying and responding to modern slavery risks in a meaningful way?
Sure. I think we have a dynamic here. Probably two things that are going on in the Australian landscape. Australia is considered geographically to be a low-risk country. And so that green line, sort of that, in terms of a traffic light system, the green can then mean low, can often mean no risk. Just psychologically, I think, in a corporate sense. Yeah. So low risk. Oh, well, there's nothing really to see here. We don't need to put energy in here because it's low. That's not where the risks are. And so we're all good, all things good. And we see this, this plays out beautifully in particularly the mining sector, which is a highly regulated industry. There are lots of regulations around safety and quality and making sure that, because there's all sorts of risks in that sector. And so there's a lot of work to ensure that people are not exploited in that sector. So that can then lead companies to think, well, it's a low risk sector. But mining is only low risk in the Australian context. It's not low risk elsewhere in places like Democratic Republic of Congo, to further north into Indonesia, in the lithium triangle in South America between Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina. Globally, mining is a high-risk sector. And so the second dynamic at play then is the psychological distancing that can occur where we think, well, low means no here, and high risk means it's somewhere else overseas. Someone else has to be looking after that. That's beyond our remit, that's beyond our spend, that's beyond our responsibility. It's the responsibility of the government over in the Congo, for example. So that can then lead to this thinking that the risks are somewhere overseas, not on my back door, not an immediate concern because, well, we've done due diligence here, we've assessed the risks here, everything's good here, and we'll get on with other things that are more pressing at this time.
And can you speak to whether you see a similar pattern within the social enterprise sector? So you've given a great insight to corporate Australia and some of the challenges there, but would you say that that's also replicated with small business, social enterprise and WISEs?
I think when it comes to social enterprises, and depends what area that they're specializing in that qualifies them to be a social enterprise. I think there's probably a higher level of awareness because they are looking to be a benefit and to make a positive contribution, whether or that's through the employment of people from, say, who are neurodivergent or from an underserved community, maybe a migrant or a refugee community, people who may be at risk of being taken advantage of, for example, being exploited. Or they're producing products and services that are actually of benefit to certain communities as well. So I think there's a heightened awareness. I can't really comment necessarily on maybe on the blind spots. They may, for example, could be in the social enterprise space that I'm closely engaged with, which is global in nature, say through the Freedom Business Alliance. These social enterprises under the rubric of a freedom business are heavily engaged and focused on working with survivors and people at high risk of being exploited. So they're working with survivors of trafficking. It's very difficult work. Many of them are coming out of a not-for-profit social work space and trying to get their heads around how to actually run a business and create meaningful employment opportunities for survivors. So it's very difficult. Lots of work around trauma-informed care. So all that energy that goes into that could mean that they're not necessarily paying attention to, for example, some of the issues around the types of products that they're manufacturing in that space. They're not necessarily. There's no energy necessarily to actually put awareness into where are those fabrics coming from, where are those inputs coming from, where am I buying the materials that I need and use that I can then help people who are at risk to develop the skills to create whatever that is, a garment or a bag or some ornament that they can then sell at market. They may not necessarily have the scope to think beyond the actual work that they're doing, and I don't hold that against them in that sense.
There's a lot of pressure with smaller organizations.
There's a lot of work. There's just a lot of work to get to business sustainability.
Yeah.
Have a meaningful engagement. Be working with people in a trauma-informed way, helping them to help them. Really, they're creating centres of economic opportunity for people. So, and then overall, their footprint is going to be very small anyway. So that's probably maybe where a gap would be, and I do see that gap. How can they think more broadly around some of the environmental and governance issues? And I'm currently in the process of working with a core group, to help them to think through that, to have stronger, more robust governance and risk management frameworks in place so that they can step up in a way that then they can be more attractive, say, to investors, to high net worth investors or family offices or corporates who would be looking for a more formal and a more robust governance framework, not just someone who's trying to scratch around trying to do a business, if that makes sense.
It does. And so with that context in mind of the operating environment for a small business or a social enterprise, what might be a starting point in terms of some specific structures, practices, or decisions that could put in place a human rights framework? What might be the simplest starting point and way for a social enterprise to engage with human rights?
Sure, I think, there's a number of things that they could do. One of them has to do with just coming back to some of the core principles around governance, questions around how decisions are made. How do we make decisions? How do we work well as a team? And what kind of, say, make some controls can we put around that will be helpful, so everyone knows what they're actually supposed to be doing, in a sense. I think that would be really helpful in terms, and from there you can think through questions around delegation and accountability. So those kind of key core governance questions, I think, are very basic and fundamental. Another thing they could be doing, particularly if they are working with vulnerable populations, is to think really, question through what is their theory of change, and to come up with a really sort of simple model around that, because It's all very well to say, particularly from a perspective of, these are very heart people. They
Mm.
really want to help people. But if they don't have a clear future of what they're working towards, then they can't actually measure that. And when it comes to then sort of the market that they're operating in, people want to know that there is a clear theory of change. They want to know that if they invest dollars in this, they may not necessarily get the return on investment in the classic sense, in a monetary sense. They might be actually just be looking, they want to support because they actually want to make a social impact, and they're trusting you as the vehicle through which they can also make that impact. So they want to know, for example, that when at whatever stage a vulnerable person comes in to that organisation, that there is some and recognizing there may be there's going to be, it's not going to be clear cut, but there are certain steps that we're taking people through, and for each step we've got core activities, and we've got clear metrics in terms of actually working out how we're going to track progress. How do we actually know that someone is progressing? Recognizing that progress could be very slow, could be very messy, could be very circular, particularly in a situation where there are psychological issues, there's trauma that needs to be worked through, even though they may have come through some sort of recovery program to begin with, and now they're stepping into your economic to actually help them to think about and work on and develop the skills to create to actually earn money, so that the slide back into exploitation, whatever that look like, is less of an option. So having those things for clear decision making and delegation and accountability structures in place, and a clear theory of change where we can actually at least have stages, even though people may step in and out of different stages, but we can at least track the progress of people, and we have a preferred future, and we have clear metrics, and that can all then go into a report, which can then be presented to funders, to donors, to governments, to grant makers, to whoever who is interested to see and to know the value that creates the value of who you are.
Brilliant. Well, that would be very helpful for social enterprise founders and team members tuning in. I'm now curious to shift gears for a minute and hear about any professional or life experiences that might have shaped your approach to what you're doing in this space.
Gosh, well,
Where to start?
where to start?
Yeah.
I was once told by someone who's probably about 15, 20 years my senior, who this was some time ago now, and he was trying to work out how old I was, and I was recounting all the things that I've done in my life, and they were like, wow, you've packed a lot in. It's
Yes.
like, yes, I
Yes.
have, and I continue to do that. So I don't know if this is going to be a very clear kind of answer. I consider myself to be a bit of a cat with nine lives. I started off in terms of my undergrad looking at studying modern history and linguistics. That landed me into advertising for 3 years. That led me to Bible College, Theological College for 4 years. I came out as an Anglican minister and I got ordained. That then led me into working overseas to explore anti-human trafficking work, if that's a clear connection there, which then has led me into running a business on consulting on business and human rights. In there's been a number of different study moments. So full on my study in terms of my bachelor, my master's in divinity, where I did theology to become a minister, the doctoral work that I did in order to better understand human trafficking intervention. And then in order to start the business, I then did an MBA at University of Technology, Sydney. So they're kind of the formal structures. I think probably in all that, at a core, I'm a heart person, but probably a strategic heart person. So I think I see a lot of commonalities to running a business to running a church, even though some people might think that seems a bit of a weird thing. But there is a sense of entrepreneurship in being a pastor, particularly in the contemporary church setting. There's a lot of transferable skills, both across the board. So those in terms of running an organization and running a volunteer type of organization where I'm, in terms of generating goodwill and the culture and really, I suppose, prevailing on people's convictions to get things done. There's no one's getting paid except for me, for example, as the pastor. So that's a hard gig. Where you at times you might feel like you're pushing a gigantic marshmallow up a hill.
Yeah.
To get things done. But that dynamic has lots of transferable skills into what I'm doing now. Except that I'm now working with people and they're getting paid, and it's a full profit experience. So that's kind of, I think that kind of the both the formal and the informal experiences have shaped who I am. The move to be involved in local church community building, transformation work, working with people, sitting alongside people, that then led to a really strong conviction around justice and what role the church plays in justice work, which then led to exploring it was very topical at the time too, the question of human trafficking, particularly into the sex industry, and churches like to major on that topic. And that was the focus of my work, but I was looking more into how to better engage men in the space, because it seemed, particularly when I was in Europe for 6 years, and that's where I did my research, that's where I was based, in Madrid in Spain, and I would go to anti-trafficking conferences in the Christian movement in Europe, 300 delegates, 290 women, 10 men, going, where are the men in this issue? Why is this a female issue? Now, there are lots of reasons why it is, but why is it only a female issue? How can we engage men more constructively? That's not to deny that there are men at work at perhaps a government level or at a police force level who are operating in certain ways. But men are often then derided just as the Johns or the users, the perpetrators. How can we actually change that narrative and engage men intelligently in areas of prevention, particularly where they might apply some of their skills that they have, maybe their skills in business, to actually create centres of economic opportunity? And that then led me to believe in social enterprise, which was the focus focus of my research, believing that actually what we need to do, if we're going to, whatever rescuing means, if we're going to help people step out of exploitation, we need them to help them to step into something which is actually full of purpose and meaning, that helps them to rebuild their lives in whatever way that they have a vision for, and help them to create a vision for. So we need to create credible economic opportunities, which will be of great benefit to them and their families as well, in their communities. So without that alternative, people will, and I've spoken to many people, the traffickers are not at all put off by the not-for-profit sector. Putting people in safe houses, taking them out of the exploitation, they're not put off that at all. You take someone out, they'll put someone in. So that's not the threat. We need legislators, and we need police force, we need prosecution to drive down the rate of traffickers and perpetrators. But we also need to support economic opportunity for people to step out and to create their own sense of freedom, because I can't empower anybody and I can't create that sense of freedom for anybody. You can have all sorts of economic opportunities and not be free in yourself. So that then drives my belief. It drives what I'm doing now, because I am a social enterprise as well, not in the classic sense, because I'm a service provider and there's some, contention around whether or not I'm a real social enterprise, but that's another conversation.
Sure.
I believe in, I am a certified social enterprise, and I support other social enterprises as the focus of my social impact is to support other social enterprises, particularly those in places like Indonesia, Cambodia, Thailand, Southeast Asia, where they don't have the same opportunities that we might have here in the Australian context. They may not have the same level of support that we have here. They may not have the same grant opportunities, for example. They might not have the type of the business context in which they can actually thrive as well. That's a very long answer. I hope that
Thank
somehow
you for
answers what
giving
I'm
a deep
saying.
insight into your story. It's incredibly dynamic. And I can see that there's so many different facets to what have informed where you are at this point in time. So you mentioned several times centres of economic opportunities, and I'm curious for yourself as a social enterprise, what have you learned about building a business that is both commercially viable and genuinely responsible and responsive to human rights issues? You know,
What
is
have I learned?
yes.
That it's borderline impossible at times. But I
In what
think it is so.
sense? Yeah.
Well, I think it's not easy to, for example, part of what we do as a social enterprise is to have an impact area where we actually make donations. We want to make donations, right? So I offer pro bono professional services to smaller organizations, but the movement as a whole, say the Freedom Business Alliance, I want to support the operations and the executive because we need them to be strong. So setting aside, allocating profits, which then enables me to be called or labeled a social enterprise at times can be very, very difficult, particularly when profitability is elusive.
Mm.
And so we can go through seasons where we're not profitable necessarily. We're barely getting by. We're still committed to setting aside quantities in order to make a donation, but that can be very, very challenging as well. And unfortunately, particularly in the context, say I'm a B Corp, the work that I do, the vast majority of my work, which is engaging corporates, is not necessarily deemed to be an impact area in their eyes because I get paid to do that, which I
Mm.
find very strange. And I have raised the question to them, but they have their own standards. But basically, the vast majority of the work that I do cannot be deemed as a social impact, even though I'm working to bring not just compliance, but transformation and change management within organizations and doing better because they're paying clients and they're reporting entities and they're obliged to do it. It's not deemed to be a social impact. And I find that very odd. That's not how my brain works. But anyway, that's how they work. So
Mm.
over here, then the work of making profit sharing and knowledge sharing is where I formally make my impact. And that can be a tension when we're simply just trying to keep the lights on.
Thanks for giving an insight and very candidly. And I'm sure that there's a lot of other social enterprise founders who will relate to that story. But it's definitely one that we need to hear that's the reality and how to challenge that as well to be able to create a sustainable business model whilst doing the impact work that we're committed to doing. So that's really insightful. I'm curious about whether you've ever been involved in any instances with organisations having to remedy human rights issues within their organisation.
No, actually, no, and I wish I had.
Why do you say that?
When I say no,
Yeah,
well, not that I want a problem to surface that we have to remedy,
yeah,
that would be a great experience. I am currently working with an organisation who is looking to do that, but it's early stage. I think the reason why it hasn't happened is because most organisations have not done enough work
yes.
to identify the risks at the level of which they would need to provide remedy. So that's the reason for that. The legislation is not strong enough at this stage, and I'm part of the consultation process with different federal bodies and state to strengthen the legislation to actually move companies to conduct the due diligence that they need to do in order to identify the real risks, which for them that then they would be exposed to a case which they would need to provide remedy. So I can help companies to set up the strategy and with the knowledge that I have and be prepared. I think at very least be prepared to think through different scenarios of where you might need to remediate. But to actually then remediate, they're not. Most companies are not far enough, mature enough in their due diligence to actually do that, and so therefore have not had the opportunity to do that yet. Now, I would like that opportunity, not because I want someone to be exploited in order for me to have the opportunity, but that would be a great opportunity to see some real grass tangible work being done on the ground, and to see how that plays out
From
as
what
well.
you've
But that's
heard in
just
other geographies, do organisations tend to do that remedy in-house or they outsource it? What type of approach have you heard of?
I think. Well, I think the approaches that I've seen often tend to be legal by nature, and I'm not a lawyer, so I think a lot of it's more about sort of righting wrongs in a statutory sort of legal sense. To could be writing underpayment, for example, or contracts that are not worth the paper that they're on. Those kind of sort of redressing those kind of sort of financial and legal things tends to be, I think, the bulk of it, of the work that's done, right, and which may satisfy some people, particularly if people are back paid, and that tends to be one of the big issues here in Australia, where people are where companies may be caught out for underpayment. I think we are not. I think it gets a little bit more blurry in working out what do I do when I'm simply sourcing from a factory somewhere in Bangladesh, and really, it's my dollar spend is not may represent a very small amount of that factory's output. And so there's other entities involved, and there's the government and the local council and the factory itself. So I think that those kind of grey areas can also mean that remedy is not necessarily applied in that level. And that remedy may be more localized to the factory, where, for example, a factory is unsafe or unclean. And so issues of OH&S are addressed. There could, for example, be a lack of sanitation. There's only toilets for men. There's no toilets for women in the factory. So let's fix that up. It could be that the factory, the machinery is unsafe. There's inadequate training. It could be that there's lack of air quality and PPE. It could be that there may be a cafeteria and the food's contaminated because it's not protected from, say, flies, for example. All those kind of sort of more tangible remedies. Companies. I haven't worked with a company yet that is needed to actually address those, but I think that's a different. That for me is meaningful, but I think a lot more of the work that we see is more around fixing up contracts and back paying and fixing up people's pay and those kind of things. And they're all very critical and important in the work, but I think there could be a lot more done in the context of exploitation to improve the working conditions of people in not just working conditions in the contractual sense, but actually in the experience of work.
So you talk about the maturity of these many organisations in Australia, and they haven't gone through that process of remedy yet. If you can just briefly, to wrap up, final train of thought, for an organisation that hears about something that has happened regarding human rights with their team, what might be the starting point for remedy? I know you mentioned there is a legal aspect to it, but rather than sweep it under the carpet, what would be, an appropriate response to investigate or address what has been heard or seen?
Yeah, I mean, we've done this kind of work where we've needed to look into different stakeholders and what role they played. So for example, there was a case that related to a client of mine back in 2022 with a shipping vehicle called AG Neptune. And this ship it's Liberian owned. It was chartered by a UK company. The fuel on the ship was from an energy company in Australia, and the ship had been refueled in Taiwan. So Liberian ship, UK charter, Australian fuel, Taiwanese loading place. And the ship, by the time it got to Australia, and it was off the coast of Queensland and Gladstone, had been there were allegations of contamination, so that sea water was contaminating the fuel. So that was the first point, the first allegation. So there was an environmental concern. By the time the ship was bound for the port of Newcastle in New South Wales, and then when the Maritime Authority then boarded the ship, then they actually discovered there were sea personnel on the ship that were suffering a range of human rights violations to do with lack of food and water and medical supplies, and they had been underpaid. So there was an owing sum 120,000 Australian dollars collectively for the 21 sea personnel. So that was then deemed to be a human rights violation. And as a result, the ship was then banned from Australian waters, and then it just disappeared out of the media, and you can't find any more information on that that scenario. But the work then we need to do from our clients, and the only relationship that our client had to this scenario was that the fuel company was one of their biggest suppliers. So as a result, then they were interested to know, well, in what ways had all those stakeholders adhered to international maritime standards and directives and et cetera. So the research then when it was that, to what extent were all those stakeholders complying with international standards? How was it that these 21 sea personnel were exploited in the first place, let alone the quality of the ship, the integrity of the ship in terms and the fuel, which was another question. So the work we then did was to investigate that, to see what was happening in the shipping sector, the shipping charter sector, the nature of the ownership of the ship. It was Liberian. The fuel refueling in Taiwan, what may have gone wrong there? At what point did those sea personnel enter aboard the ship, and at what point were they did they find themselves in a situation of exploitation? So that was the work that we got involved in from a case study research perspective.
Well, thank you very much for sharing. And Stephen, you've been so generous with sharing your knowledge today. So thank you for joining me. I'm just curious about where people can connect in with you and Unchained Solutions if they'd like to follow up.
Sure, you can look us up. Don't put in Unchained because you'll get Unchained Melody. That won't take you anywhere. Probably about 2 pages of the song. So Unchained Solutions, if you Google that, you'll find us. We'll come up. And you can connect with us through our website, email address at info@unchainedSolutions.com.au. If you didn't find me on social media, you've kind of got issues, except I'm not on TikTok. But LinkedIn is the way to go. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. That would be the best case. I'm constantly have that open, and through our website as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen.
My pleasure.